From Russia with love, but is it time to ditch a toxic relationship?
Would you say it is embarrassing, though, as President Trump said, that European countries are funding that war?
Well, we definitely are doing more. So it is of great regret that we haven't been able to put all these member states in the same position that getting rid of the Russian oil and gas. That's true.
European Commission Vice President Kaja Kallas speaking to Sky News' Yalda Hakim. Felicity, what's the story?
The story is that the International Energy Agency said on Tuesday that Russia's revenues from crude oil and refined products fell again in September, having fallen in August as well. The IEA said the revenues fell by $920 million from July to $13.51 billion and then fell again to $13.35 billion in September. For refined products, which is like gasoline and diesel that you make in a refinery, that means the revenues for them specifically have plunged to the lowest in a decade. To be clear, while overall Russian energy exports are falling, within that, crude exports, so that's your crude oil and your natural gas that hasn't been refined, have actually risen. But that's because Russia is refining less oil domestically because its refineries are being hit by Ukraine strikes, which I'm sure we'll get onto. So the money that they're making from crude is actually offsets what they're losing. So there's still quids in, but it's an interesting picture nonetheless that overall the revenue is falling, which is a bit complicated.
It is. So just, give us a very basic answer to the question, why? Why are Russian energy exports falling? Because some people would say, why is that happening now rather than at any point since the war began?
A range of reasons. Western sanctions is one reason. The price of oil is falling. But I think one of the most interesting ones is that Ukraine has ramped up its strategy of hitting Russian energy infrastructure. So persistent attacks that have grown by Ukraine have cut Russian crude processing by an estimated 500,000 barrels per day. So Ukraine is now targeting oil refineries specifically because that's how they think they're going to hit Russia best. Russia is still, this is a real David and Goliath story. Like Russia is Goliath here, has a much bigger military budget. It's making advances on the battlefield. Ukraine is increasingly making its own homegrown missiles and drones and is now looking to be more strategic and hit Russia where it thinks it's going to hurt the most.
Harriet, do you think this will be hurting Putin in that context? It's a huge revenue maker for Russia. It's dipped a bit. Does it matter as much as Western leaders would like to say it does?
It's an interesting question because the refined oil products like gasoline and diesel that are being made in the refineries that are being hit by Ukrainian strikes is actually a relatively small part of the picture. That's mostly affecting actual Russian people who aren't able to get gas and diesel. It's not so much hitting the Kremlin, which, as Felicity explained, is the exports of crude oil and natural gas are going up. And the problem is, I think people would be really surprised to learn how much EU countries still pay Russia for oil and gas.
Go on, surprise us.
1.15 billion euros every month for their fossil fuels. And that's actually mostly only 5 countries, and the top 2 are Hungary and Slovakia, because they're both really landlocked countries without any port entry that's possible for importing crude oil and pipeline gas. And most of that is coming from Eastern Russia. And Hungary actually gets 60% of its energy from oil and gas. So it's really, really, really important to both Hungary and Slovakia. And the question of whether or not this is going to hit the Kremlin or hit Putin in any reasonable way, it's no surprise that just this week that Slovakia kind of vetoed this this new round of EU sanctions against Russia because Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico is so strongly aligned with Putin. But he used his veto power to once again block this deal on a new round of EU sanctions against Russia, which would have also targeted oil infrastructure and liquefied natural gas. So it's a broader picture than just Ukrainian strikes are hitting oil refineries that could be affecting Russians.
And Jamie, how important are oil and gas revenues in helping Putin fight the war against Ukraine?
Yeah, Quite. Fossil fuel earnings have kind of directly funded Moscow's war machine. And so obviously reductions then in revenue make sustaining high levels of military spending harder, but it's kind of not impossible. The Kremlin kind of has options. It can draw down savings, it can reprioritize the budget, switch kind of taxes. It obviously does remove some of the leeway that they have in terms of how they can spend their fossil fuel money. But they've kind of they have shown their flexibility in that regard. And I think that's kind of why we're now looking to, this in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the kind of Western governments talk more and more about what to do with the frozen assets. I mean, they've immobilized hundreds of billions in Russian state and central bank assets since 2022. It's been a big, long process to try and, there's been calls since the beginning of the war to turn that value or profits from those assets to provide like loans for Ukraine's defense. It's obviously very complex in terms of the legal side of things, but it's a big worry for Moscow. And whether or not, the UK and some of the EU have said that they're ready to progress those plans now, but we've kind of seen from the Kremlin recently that they've said how kind of crucial to stop that they think it is. So I think that's where we're really looking at the next steps.
President Trump has been talking to international leaders, hasn't he, saying that continuing to buy oil and gas from Russia is funding the war against Europe. Who the hell does that, he said, or words to that effect. You Europeans are giving your enemy money to fight you. And he has a point there, doesn't he? But I suppose the answer to that is, as you were just saying, it's such a complicated economic picture that maybe the likes of Hungary and Slovakia spending a bit less won't make that much difference.
Yeah, and I think, he's actually just this week said that the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has agreed to stop buying Russian oil. Whether or not that actually happens, as with most of the things that Trump says, it may be he's heard one thing and then it's something will happen is another. Moscow's biggest customers are kind of China, India, Turkey. They've reprioritized massively. Trump said this week that he's got to now get China to do the same thing, as well as kind of pushing Japan. Unfortunately, I think it'll be a period of time of kind of moving away from a situation where India can actually, it's not like they can just put a halt on it immediately. So while it's a good thing, if it does come to pass, it's very complex.
I suppose the point is, Felicity, China can buy more oil and gas if European countries stop. But what China can't do is make up for the difference in assets that European countries and America are spending to fund Ukraine. China can't help him out of that hole.
Yeah, that's true. I think the India and China element of this is really interesting because when Western sanctions and an oil embargo was put on Russia by the EU, part of the strategy was to pivot and to start selling to India and China. So for a while that has worked quite well, but there is now international pressure on India and China from the US, from UK, to try and sever those links to place more pressure on Putin. I think what is not commonly realised is that there are a number of loopholes that means that oil from Russia can be sold to India and China, where it is then turned into other products like jet fuel, etc., which is then bought back. So it looks ostensibly as if we're buying products from India and China, but the origins is from Russia. So there's lots of loopholes that haven't been closed, which means indirectly the UK and EU countries are still funding the Russian war effort. And also a lot of Russian oil products are carried on UK insured ships. So it's all very kind of tangled up. And as Harriet was saying, it's kind of staggering, actually, that most EU nations, 17 of the 27, have actually paid more into the Russian economy than they've sent in military and financial aid to Ukraine. And that seems, even with all the talk, I think the talk recently about what we do with these frozen assets and how do we realise more money out of them is a good step and very interesting, but it's taken an awful long time. And in that time, we have basically been propping up Russia.
I suppose, though, Harriet, it's a war of attrition, isn't it? That's the point. The likes of the UK don't want to get directly involved. So what we're doing is slowly chipping away at what Putin has available to him. And all of this taken together, using the frozen assets, attacking his gas fields with drones from Ukraine and now buying less of the oil in the first place. They're small gains, but they are gains in the right direction from our perspective.
Are they though? Like, are they really gains? Because the assumption or the narrative was that all of these Western sanctions would absolutely cripple the Russian economy, and that has in no way happened. All of the assumptions were that we could import less oil, less gas, and also less nickel and iron and steel from Russia as well. And that is true. We have been importing less, but at the same time, our EU's imports of fertilizer from Russia, which is what we need for farming, has increased by almost 20% between 2021 and 2025.
Wow. I mean, and that is something we can make, fertilizer, right? The Russians don't do anything special, I don't presume.
They are a major producer and exporter, but yeah, that's 20% increase since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So yes, our reliance, the European Union reliance on Russian gas and oil has decreased, but it is still very much a reliance. Like, I think it would be disingenuous to imply that Hungary or Slovakia will allow Russian oil and gas imports into the EU to stop, because they can't. The other thing that you mentioned about the frozen assets, the UK might have said that it is ready to progress to using the value of those frozen assets. It hasn't actually done anything yet.
No, why is that, do you think? Is that to mobilise the threat?
That it's not true to say nothing's been done. We have been sending funds to Ukraine using some of the profits and interest accrued on those assets.
Yeah.
But the fact that we're sat here in 2025 saying that once again European leaders are meeting to discuss using the frozen Russian assets for a loan to Ukraine. So yes, it's a war of attrition, but it's definitely one that Russia is not losing.
They're losing humans, though, aren't they, Jamie? They are losing soldiers. Maybe they're losing public opinion. Maybe attritionally in that sense in Russia, it can only go on so long.
Yeah, I mean, the military losses are huge. First 8 months of this year, Russia lost 281,550 soldiers, which is kind of a leaked Russian data that the Ukrainian intelligence got hold of. They're having to, again, look at reservists and conscription. But I also think what's interesting is geopolitically, Russia has lost quite a lot of its standing since the war, particularly in places like the Middle East. We saw, obviously, Trump's big global peace meeting in Egypt that Russia wasn't invited to, and Russia tried to do their own kind of version of the Middle East meeting that they then had to cancel because people didn't want to turn up. So there is a kind of turning, it feels, a little bit against Russia. Whether that, actually results in, Harriet was saying, in people actually taking action or stopping things. I think the kind of precedent of using the frozen assets is massive, and I think that probably is part of what it says for future wars and conflicts. Is probably part of the hesitancy. But I do feel like, from what I've read, there is a kind of feeling that Russia is losing some of its global standing and some of its power. We can see from India saying they're going to stop. If that's true, then that does show that, maybe as we move forward, it is bit by bit, but it is isolating Russia. It is, they are losing that battle.
Just finally, Felicity, this is your story. Why do you think this story this week is important? Because it sounds like the falls in revenue are relatively marginal proportionally, and for all the reasons that the other panelists have explained, this might not be a significant moment.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, I think it's a gradual kind of weakening that you're seeing from Russia. And I think a lot of the commentary that you're seeing is, yes, Russia is very robust. Its military budget, although also declining, is still very, very strong. But can this last forever? It does seem like that question is being posed now. And that, yes, this could go on for another few years. Russia's still very, very powerful. But eventually, I think it looks like they're running out of steam, basically. I also think something that we touched upon very briefly, but just to come back to, I think what will bother Putin is popular opinion. And while sort of some of the commentary is saying that like the Ukrainian drone campaign is not a decisive blow to Russia, it is hurting ordinary Russians. And that's important because you might not hear about that straight away, but it has already started to take an effect. And even Putin will be keeping an eye on that. If Russian public opinion continues to turn, that could affect the war.